Welcome back to my channel. This video will cover 4 common tactics of trolls you need to be aware of. Turns out there are actual names given to some of these tactics I described in my videos. For example, there's one called Brandolini's Law, also known as the BS asymmetry principle. It is about the effort it takes to debunk misinformation in comparison to the relative ease of creating it in the first place. The law states the following. The amount of energy needed to refute BS is an order of magnitude bigger than the amount needed to produce it. As one journalist described a situation like this, it took this guy 15 minutes to make his video, and it took me 3 days to fact check. We can even see this reported by Frederick Bastiat way back in 1845. By the way, I strongly recommend people read his book entitled The Law. It's quite short, but excellent. Anyway, he wrote on this subject, quote, "We must confess that our adversaries have a marked advantage over us in the discussion. In very few words they can announce a half-truth, and in order to demonstrate that it is incomplete, we are obliged to have recourse to long and dry dissertations," unquote. Notice that last part and compare it to the common whining you would see posted in my comment section when I was on YouTube, specifically that my responses to their posts are long and boring, all while they ignore the content of my responses. Seems we have a match. It's also worth pointing out that these people complain about my long posts, which typically take a minute or so to read. They are far shorter than the live streams they are supporting. Those can last for hours, giving about as much substance as could be said in a much more structured format in maybe 15 minutes or so. So it can't be the length that matters when they complain about my comments. I think it is just another way to distract from my arguments. Another way Brandolini's Law appears is when people use pseudo-profound BS, or by referencing some expert supposedly saying something they really didn't say. It takes much more work to show these things are false than it does to make them up in the first place. So someone could claim there are studies that prove what he says, but I have to do a lot more research to show it proved no such thing, or even that the author of the studies clearly said it wasn't even about what my opponent claimed. I dealt with an important example of this when someone claimed that communication was only 7% words. The other 93% was tone of voice and body language. It was easy to make that claim with no thought whatsoever. You can find a huge number of internet sources regurgitating that claim as if it is an accepted fact. Trouble is, none of those I looked at actually examined the claim at all. This included well-known educational institutions. They just blindly accepted it. I did a major video on this. It started out just examining the logic behind it to show it made no sense. I methodically went through 3 scenarios to show why. But I didn't stop there. I noticed that a much smaller number of internet sources were disagreeing with the claim. More importantly, I saw that they actually examined the studies the claim is based on, including how they were done, what people were included in the study, and what the data was really based on. At every point, the actual details completely undermined the 7% claim. But I didn't stop there. I found an interview with the author of the 2 studies, and he clearly said they were not about general communication at all, and that it was basically absurd to think words were only 7% of that. That was an example of Brandolini's Law. It took almost no effort to make the initial claim, or even to say it was based on a couple of studies, making it seem to have a scientific basis. It took far more work to actually show the illogic, flawed data, and, of course, the interview with the author of the relevant studies. The person promoting the false claim never backed off from it. In fact, he kept saying that I needed to do research, but he never offered any research himself, all while still promoting the same empty claim. The only research was done by me. BS isn't concerned about truth, evidence, or logic, but a proper refutation must take those things into account. Think of the many things I've proven people were wrong or even lied about. It's like when they just altered the words someone said. It's easy to do that. It takes far more work to prove it isn't true since I have to actually find the original words. Heck, I remember one where a guy made a point to say he had simply cut and pasted the person's words. Yet I found the words and he had actually changed them. How do you get different words if you cut and pasted them? Some people will lie about the most basic things. Another problem is that even when something is disproven, many people still believe it. So the tactic must be addressed repeatedly so fewer people get fooled. Think how much more effective these tactics are when someone says you need to cam up. The advantage of these tactics is magnified in a situation where you don't have time to do the proper research, but making stuff up is easy. There is a closely related technique to Brandolini's law. It is called the Gish gallop. A debater using this will confront an opponent with a rapid series of many specious arguments, half-truths, misrepresentations, and outright lies in a short space of time, which makes it impossible for the opponent to refute all of them in a normal discussion. Each point raised by the Gish galloper takes considerably more time to refute or fact-check than it did to state in the first place, thus doing much the same as Brandolini's law, but bigger. The technique wastes an opponent's time and may cast doubt on his debating ability for an audience unfamiliar with the technique, especially if no independent fact-checking is involved or if the audience has limited knowledge of the facts. It's bad enough when dealing with just one claim, as in Brandolini's law. This tactic is a big escalation. A closely related topic to the two already mentioned is the practice of dodging a question by asking questions in return instead of just answering a question already on the table. I covered an example of this a while back as well. It was a reaction to a live stream where the host started off asking a very basic question. His opponent immediately changed the focus with questions of his own. Every time the host returned to the original question, he was told they'd get to it, but first he had to respond to his guest's questions. This went on, and no surprise, the original question was never answered. The tactic worked, at least at that moment, until I documented it in one of my videos. Still, my channel was small, so most people who got misled never saw my reaction. I ran into these tactics many times when debating on text-based forums. Most typically, I'd ask a question. My opponent wouldn't answer, instead asking a question of their own. I would tell them I'd be glad to answer after they answered my original question, which came first. They wouldn't do it. They would insist I had to answer first. After extensive back and forth on this, and even though I knew the game they were playing, I would answer their question. But just to prove a point, I'd answer and then say something like, "Okay, now answer my question." I bet you aren't surprised to know they still wouldn't do it, but would just ask another question which they insisted must be answered first. For me, it wasn't a problem. After all, I'm always ready to point out the tactics unethical people use, so this just let me point a common one out in real time. But since most honest people are always hoping they can have a useful discussion, they will get very frustrated. In those cases, it is the unethical person who seems to win. My task is to keep pointing out the tactics so they don't. Let's look at one more common tactic I've seen on discussion forums. It is one of those which essentially rigs the debate from the start. In this, it is much like the tactic of rigging things by ignoring what someone actually says, by making claims based on their body language. Both tactics are quite self-serving. There is a good chance you have heard this one applied, and maybe even, unfortunately, use it yourself. There are various ways to say it, but one would be, "It's the struck dog that yelps." I bet most of you, whether you've heard or used it yourself, haven't really thought it through. The way it is used is to claim if someone makes attacks on you and you object, that very objection somehow proves the attacks are valid. Really? That's the assumption they make. You are the dog that got hit with a stone they threw, and sure, you may yelp when attacked. But how the heck does that prove you are guilty of whatever it is they claimed about you? Let's consider an actual example. Quote, "If it really did hurt you, more than likely that person hit a nerve. It's just the truth. If it hurts you and you have to, mention it to another person, that means it hit a nerve. And if something hit a nerve, then there might be some reality towards it." Unquote. Sorry, but it isn't just the truth. It is a self-serving but empty claim made by people who not only want to make up false accusations about you, but to use any objection about their false claims as some sort of proof that they were right. It's a tactic that would fit in quite well in an old Soviet show trial. Perhaps we should look at it logically. You see, this tactic leaves out the obvious question of whether anyone should have thrown a rock to begin with. You see, a dog which is doing something wrong will absolutely yelp if you hit it with a rock. But so will the dog which is minding its own business, but you hit it with a rock anyway. The yelping has nothing to do with whether the dog is guilty of anything. It's the rock thrower that is the key problem. The person in that example took it an extra step. You'll love this. Quote, "But if it is not true and you get butt hurt, there's only two things. It could be true that a nerve got hit, or the second part, you're just not sure about yourself. That you've got some self-esteem issues. Plain and simple." Unquote. So we can give them points for creativity, but nothing for common sense or integrity. Remember, just as with the first part, it comes down to any effort to defend yourself is just another excuse to say you are in the wrong. Stalin would be proud. Now, nor are there only two possibilities, and it sure isn't plain and simple, more like plain and stupid. It never crosses their mind, or at least they hope it doesn't cross the minds of their audience, that people just don't like having bogus attacks made against them. Essentially, the logic these people use just gives them a license to misrepresent others, but rig things so any defense is automatically proof that the accuser is correct. Have the people who believe such nonsensical claims just failed to think it through, thus the reason for this video? Or maybe they are well aware of how bogus it is, but it works for them in place of honest debate, thus they'll try to use it anyway. It isn't more than likely the accuser hit a nerve. It's quite likely the targeted person just doesn't like being defamed. I've seen many false accusations made about various YouTubers without a shred of evidence being provided, and then read the comments to the videos and see people say something like, "I used to like them, but now that I've seen your video, I'm unsubscribing to their channel." But it's all based on a lie that is spoken with confidence. They've been suckered, and saying it's just the truth doesn't make it the truth. But I hear that line a lot, as if repeatedly declaring what they say is the truth somehow makes it the truth. Reality doesn't work that way. The tactic only works if you accept such silly, self-serving rules. I don't. The situation is not plain and simple unless you are simple-minded. Thanks for watching, and don't let the trolls stop you from speaking out.